My name is Hannah. I am 33 years old, and I thought my fifth wedding anniversary would end with a romantic toast. Instead, it ended with my husband slapping me across the face in front of 500 elite guests while his family laughed. They thought they were putting a worthless orphan back in her place. They had no idea that the phone call I made right after wiping the blood from my lip would wipe their century-old legacy off the map by sunrise. If you have ever been treated like you are nothing by the people who are supposed to be your family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe because you will want to see exactly how this arrogant family got exactly what they deserved. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was glittering with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with New York high society. It was supposed to be a celebration of my 5 years of marriage to Bradley Montgomery. Instead, my father-in-law Winston took the microphone. He tapped his spoon against his champagne flute, demanding the attention of the city's wealthiest investors, politicians, and socialites. I stood next to Bradley, wearing a smile I had perfected over half a decade of their subtle emotional abuse. But tonight, Winston was not being subtle. When Bradley told me he wanted to marry Hannah, I warned him. Winston's booming voice echoed through the massive speakers. I told him that a man of his stature could have any heiress on the East Coast. Instead, he chose a charity case, a girl with no family, no background, and no real career. He paused, letting the murmurs ripple through the crowd. We gave this worthless orphan our prestigious name, and what does she do? She plays pretend with a little freelance business consulting gig, bringing absolutely nothing to the Montgomery empire. So tonight, I want to raise a glass to my son for carrying the burden of a wife who contributes absolutely nothing to our legacy. The silence in the room was deafening. I looked at Bradley, expecting him to defend me, to take the microphone from his father, or at least look apologetic. Instead, he was smirking. He raised his glass along with his father, validating every cruel word. For 5 years, I had played the role of the grateful, quiet daughter-in-law. I endured Penelope, my sister-in-law, making snide remarks about my clothes. I tolerated Terrence, the family's chief financial officer, talking down to me at every Sunday dinner, as if I did not understand basic math. They all believed I was just a penniless consultant, surviving on their charity. They had no idea that my consulting business was actually a highly classified training ground, a 5-year test to prove I was ruthless enough to inherit my true family's empire. I did not cry. I did not run out of the ballroom. I simply picked up my champagne glass, took a slow sip, and walked right up to the stage. I signaled the audio technician to hand me a spare microphone. Thank you for that lovely toast, Winston, I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly across the ballroom. It is true my freelance consulting business might seem small to a man who inherited everything he owns, but I find it very interesting that this worthless orphan is the only reason you are all standing in the Plaza Hotel tonight. Winston's face turned a dangerous shade of red. What nonsense are you babbling about, you ungrateful girl? I smiled warmly at the crowd. I am talking about the $50,000 deposit required to secure this magnificent ballroom. You see, everyone, the Montgomery corporate accounts have been completely frozen for 2 weeks. Winston's credit cards were declined at the catering office. Terrence tried to wire the funds, but the bank rejected it due to insufficient capital. So I used my little freelance corporate card to pay the bill. If it were not for my charity, the Montgomery family would be holding this anniversary dinner in a fast food parking lot. A collective gasp swept through the 500 guests. Whispers of bankruptcy and frozen assets erupted instantly among the investors in the room. I had just publicly exposed the financial ruin they had been desperately trying to hide from the elite society of New York. Winston dropped his microphone, clutching his chest in absolute horror. Before I could even turn off my own microphone, a heavy hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. It was Bradley. His face was contorted with pure rage, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He did not say a word. He just swung his arm back and slapped me across the face with everything he had. The crack of his palm against my cheek echoed through the silent ballroom. The force of the blow sent me stumbling backward, my heel catching on the edge of the stage. I caught my balance, tasting the metallic tang of blood welling up in the corner of my mouth. Instead of gasping in horror, Bradley's family burst into laughter. Penelope covered her mouth, giggling at my humiliation. Winston nodded in approval, watching me wipe the blood from my lip. I looked at the man I had called my husband for 5 years. I did not scream. I calmly reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my phone. I dialed the one number I had sworn not to call until my 5-year trial was over. The line picked up on the first ring. "Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the cruel laughter of my in-laws. "Please come." Bradley laughed so hard he had to hold his stomach. "Dad, are you seriously calling your dad?" he sneered, turning to his wealthy friends. "She is calling a ghost from the orphanage to come save her. What is he going to do, Hannah? Haul us away in a stolen minivan?" I lowered my phone, looking at Bradley with eyes as cold as ice. He had no idea what he had just done. The laughter in the ballroom was a physical weight pressing against my shoulders. Bradley was practically glowing with the thrill of having humiliated me. But before he could launch into another tirade about my supposedly pathetic background, the crowd shifted. Terrence pushed his way to the front of the stage. As the chief financial officer of the Montgomery Empire, Terrence carried himself with an air of absolute superiority. He adjusted his bespoke suit jacket, his face set in a scowl of pure irritation. He did not care about the physical abuse I had just endured. He only cared about the optics. He pulled a thick legal document from his breast pocket and slapped it onto the podium right next to my hand. "Sign it," Terrence ordered, tapping a gold pen against the paper. "Right now, Hannah. We are done playing these games with you." I glanced down at the bold heading on the first page. It was a post-nuptial asset surrender. They were demanding that I relinquish any and all claims to the Montgomery estate, including the modest townhome Bradley and I shared, and walk away with absolutely nothing. "You have lost your mind, Terrence," I said, my voice steady despite the stinging pain in my cheek. Terrence scoffed, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a stubborn toddler. "I am the one holding this family together financially, while you drain our resources," he shot back. "I have spent 5 years scrubbing your embarrassing lack of pedigree from our corporate bios. I have covered up your worthless freelance consulting gigs so our investors would not realize Bradley married a street rat. But tonight is different. The CEO of Croft Holdings is arriving in exactly 3 minutes to sign a $150 million bailout for our logistics division. I will not let a charity case ruin the biggest deal in our corporate history." Penelope sauntered up beside her husband, linking her arm through his. She looked me up and down with utter disgust. "You heard him, Hannah. Croft Holdings demands a clean corporate structure before they wire the funds. That means cutting off the dead weight. Sign the paper, take the service elevator down to the alley where you belong, and maybe Terrence will write you a check for a taxi." I looked at the document again. It was poorly drafted, full of glaring loopholes that any first-year law student could exploit. My 5 years operating undercover had honed my financial and legal expertise to a razor-sharp edge. "This contract is void the moment I sign it under duress," I pointed out, maintaining direct eye contact with Terrence. "And your valuation of the company assets is inflated by at least 40%. If Croft Holdings runs a genuine audit, your bailout will evaporate." Terrence flushed with anger, stepping closer to intimidate me. "Do not presume to lecture me about finance. You know absolutely nothing about high-level corporate acquisitions. You have exactly 60 seconds to sign this before Winston has you dragged out of here by your hair." Winston stepped up beside his son, his face purple with rage. "Call security," Winston barked to a nearby waiter. "Get this ungrateful wretch out of my sight before Mr. Croft walks through those doors." The waiter scrambled for his radio, but he never had the chance to use it. A heavy, deafening thud echoed from the back of the ballroom. The music abruptly cut off. The orchestra members lowered their instruments in shock. 500 elite guests turned their heads in unison as the massive oak doors of the plaza ballroom were thrown wide open. A dozen security guards in matching black suits marched into the room in perfect synchronization. They did not ask people to move. They forcefully parted the sea of wealthy socialites, creating a wide, clear path straight from the entrance to the stage where I stood. The sheer presence of the security detail made the room drop a dozen degrees in temperature. Then, he walked in. Jonathan Croft was a man who needed no introduction. As the most ruthless billionaire on the East Coast, his reputation preceded him. He moved with a terrifying quiet authority. His tailored charcoal suit commanded respect, and his piercing eyes scanned the room with the precision of a predator stepping into a cage of prey. The arrogance instantly drained from the Montgomery family. Winston visibly paled, his aggressive posture crumbling into immediate subservience. Bradley stood up straight, frantically wiping a drop of spilled champagne from his lapel. Terrence shoved the post-nuptial document back into his pocket, plastering on a desperate, eager smile. They all scrambled off the stage, rushing forward like desperate peasants eager to kiss the ring of their king. Mr. Croft Winston gasped, practically tripping over his own feet to reach the billionaire first. "We are so incredibly honored that you came in person. The paperwork is fully prepared for your signature, and we assure you the minor disturbance here has been handled." Terrence stepped up right beside Winston, extending his hand enthusiastically. "It is an absolute privilege, sir. I am Terrence, the Chief Financial Officer. I have prepared the final asset ledgers for your review. We are ready to finalize the $150 million capital injection immediately." Jonathan Croft did not slow his pace. He did not look at Winston. He did not acknowledge Terrence. He walked straight through them, his broad shoulders physically brushing Winston aside, as if the patriarch of the Montgomery family was nothing more than a minor obstacle in his path. The eager smiles on their faces froze. Winston's outstretched hand hung awkwardly in the empty air. Jonathan walked directly up the steps of the stage and stopped dead in his tracks right in front of me. The entire ballroom held its breath. Nobody dared to make a sound. For a fraction of a second, the cold, ruthless billionaire facade cracked, revealing the fierce, protective father underneath. His eyes instantly zeroed in on the dark, swelling bruise forming on my cheek and the fresh streak of blood staining my lip. He slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping over Winston Terrence and finally landing on Bradley. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with an impending execution. When Jonathan spoke, his voice was not a shout. It was a low, lethal rumble that reverberated through the silent ballroom and sent a shiver down the spine of every person present. "Who touched my daughter?" The silence that followed my father's question was absolute. 500 guests stopped breathing. The string quartet players froze in their seats. I watched the blood drain from Bradley's face so fast he looked like a corpse. Winston swayed on his feet, his jaw hanging open, while Terrence stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Daughter." The words seemed to echo off the crystal chandeliers. Bradley took a trembling step backward, bumping into the podium. He looked from the terrifying billionaire standing protectively in front of me, back to my bruised face. Hannah Bradley stammered, his voice cracking into a high pitch. "What is he talking about?" I did not answer him immediately. Instead, I reached for my left hand. Slowly and deliberately, I slid the diamond wedding band off my finger. I held it up to the light for a brief second, then dropped it directly into Bradley's half-empty champagne glass. It sank to the bottom with a quiet clink. "I am talking about the end of my probation period," I said, keeping my tone conversational and light. 5 years ago, I made a deal with my father. He believed that growing up with the Croft name would make me soft, that inheriting billions would make me a target for parasites, so we agreed. I would go undercover. I would build a life without his money, without his influence, and prove I had the resilience to survive in the real world. Winston grabbed the edge of the stage, gasping for air. "This is a mistake," he wheezed. "You are a freelance consultant. You told us your parents passed away." I smiled down at him. "A necessary fiction, Winston. I needed to see how people behave when they think they hold all the power over someone who has nothing. And your family provided an excellent case study in human cruelty. But the disguise is no longer necessary." I turned to face the crowd of investors, socialites, and reporters who were now hanging on to my every word. "Allow me to reintroduce myself. I am Hannah Croft, and as of this morning, I am the officially appointed Chief Executive Officer of Croft Holdings." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Camera flashes started going off. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The investors who had just heard Winston brag about a massive bailout were now staring at him with pure disgust. My father placed a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder. His glare remained fixed on Bradley. I asked a question. Jonathan said, his voice dropping an octave. "Who put their hands on the CEO of my company?" Bradley began to shake violently. He held his hands up in surrender, backing away until he hit the wall. "Mr. Croft, I swear it was a misunderstanding. I did not know. I would never have—" "You would never have hit me if you knew I was rich," I finished for him. "But because you thought I was a poor orphan, you felt entitled to treat me like a punching bag. That tells me everything I need to know about your character, Bradley. And it tells me everything I need to know about your company." I turned my attention to Terrence. The chief financial officer was sweating profusely, his arrogant posture completely gone. He was calculating the fallout, realizing his entire career was collapsing in real time. "Terrence!" I called out, making sure my voice carried across the room. "You have been waiting all night for the CEO of Croft Holdings to arrive and sign the $150 million acquisition deal. You wanted a clean corporate structure to save your dying logistics empire. Well, the CEO is here." Terrence swallowed hard, pasting on a sickeningly desperate smile. "Hannah, please, we can talk about this in private. The acquisition is mutually beneficial. We are family." "We were never family," I corrected him sharply. "And regarding your bailout, I have reviewed the asset ledgers you provided. I also reviewed the hidden debt structures you thought you successfully buried. As my first official act as CEO of Croft Holdings, I am formally withdrawing our acquisition offer. The deal is dead." Winston let out a strangled cry, clutching his chest. Terrence took a step forward, panic replacing his fake smile. "You cannot do that. We have vendors expecting payment tomorrow. We have payroll. We have secured creditors. If you pull out now, the bank will foreclose on everything we own." "I know," I replied coldly. "I suggest you pack your office tonight. By 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, the Montgomery logistics empire will officially be bankrupt." I turned my back on them, linking my arm through my father's. It was time to leave them to the wreckage of their own making. The security detail pivoted, ready to escort us out of the ballroom. But as I took my first step away, the sound of slow, sarcastic clapping broke through the murmurs of the crowd. I stopped and looked back over my shoulder. Terrence had straightened his suit jacket. The panic had vanished from his face, replaced by a dark, venomous smirk. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick manila folder. "That was a brilliant performance," Hannah Terrence called out, his voice dripping with malice. "Truly an incredible plot twist, but you forgot one tiny detail during your little undercover assignment." He opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, waving it in the air for the crowd to see. "Not so fast," Terrence sneered. "You might be a billionaire heiress now, but you are still legally married to Bradley. And more importantly, your signature is right here on the personal guarantor forms for his corporate loans. You co-signed the debt, Hannah." My father tensed beside me, but I remained perfectly still. Terrence began to laugh, stepping closer to the stage. "You want to bankrupt us tomorrow morning? Go ahead. But the moment the banks call in those loans, they are going to come looking for the guarantor. And since you are the newly minted CEO of Croft Holdings with pockets full of cash, they are going to drain you dry to pay our debts. If we burn Hannah, we are dragging you right down with us." I did not sleep that night. By 6 the next morning, I was sitting at the head of the obsidian conference table on the top floor of the Croft Holdings Tower. My father stood by the window, watching the city wake up, while his elite legal team surrounded me. They looked anxious as they pored over the document Terrence had shoved in my face the night before. The personal guarantor form. It looked legitimate. It had the official Montgomery corporate seal, Bradley's messy scrawl, and right at the bottom, my signature, in thick black ink. A signature that supposedly tied me, and by extension, the Croft empire, to hundreds of millions in toxic debt. The lead counsel, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, slid the document across the table to me. She tapped her pen against the bottom line. "It is a very good fake, Hannah," she said, "but it is a fake. Look at the pressure points on the ink under the magnifying glass. He did not forge it by hand, he spliced it." I leaned in and examined the curves of my own name. Then a memory clicked into place. 3 years ago, Terrence had demanded I sign a joint tax amendment for Bradley because their accounting department needed it expedited. I had signed it, in black pen pressing hard against a granite countertop in their kitchen. Terrence had taken the original and rushed out the door. "He lifted it from our joint tax returns," I said, sliding the paper back to Patricia. He scanned it, isolated the signature, and printed it directly onto the loan documents. The legal team immediately erupted into overlapping conversations. They started talking about filing injunctions and drafting police reports. They wanted to drag Terrence into a lengthy court battle over document fraud. They wanted to freeze the Montgomery assets pending a federal investigation. I held up my hand, instantly silencing the room. A court battle would take months. I did not have months. I wanted to crush them today. For 5 years, Winston and Bradley treated me like a useless freelancer. They thought my consulting work meant I was struggling to find clients to pay for my own groceries. They mocked me every time I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. They never realized that while I was quietly doing minor data entry for their logistics company to earn my keep, I was mapping their entire corporate infrastructure. My father had not sent me into that toxic family just to learn humility. He sent me to learn how to dismantle an empire from the inside out. I pulled my laptop from my bag and connected it to the main projector in the room. I bypassed the Montgomery Company's public servers and accessed the administrative backdoors I had quietly installed on Terrence's network 2 years ago. Rows of restricted financial data flooded the screen. If Terrence was desperate enough to commit federal document fraud to secure a bailout, he was hiding something much worse than a failing logistics market. I cross-referenced their accounts payable with their vendor invoices. My fingers flew across the keyboard, executing the forensic accounting protocols I had perfected during my undercover years. Within 20 minutes, the software flagged a massive discrepancy. The legal team watched in stunned silence as I traced the flow of capital. The Montgomery Company was not failing because of a bad economy or poor management. It was bleeding out from a severed artery. Millions of dollars had been funneled out of the corporate accounts disguised as payments to international shipping vendors. But when I tracked the routing numbers of those specific vendors, they did not lead to shipping ports. They led to offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. $12 million in total had completely vanished from Winston's balance sheets over the last 3 years. And I knew exactly who set up those shell accounts. Terrence, the brilliant, untouchable African-American chief financial officer who loved to parade his superiority, had been systematically robbing his own father-in-law blind. He had used the failing market as a smokescreen to cover his embezzlement. And when the company finally hit rock bottom, he tried to use me as a human shield to pay off the debts he had created. I closed my laptop with a sharp snap. The lawyers stared at me, waiting for my command. I did not ask them to file a lawsuit. I did not ask them to call the police. I simply picked up my car keys and walked toward the elevator. "Where are you going?" Patricia asked, standing up quickly. I stepped into the elevator and looked back at her as the doors began to close. Winston Bradley and Terrence are currently sitting in the Montgomery corporate boardroom. They think they have a leash around my neck. They are probably pouring themselves drinks right now, celebrating their brilliant plan to extort the Croft fortune. I am going to go show them exactly who they just tried to blackmail. The drive from the Croft Holdings Tower to the Montgomery Logistics headquarters took exactly 18 minutes. For 5 years, I had made this exact commute in a battered sedan, wearing cheap suits, pretending to be grateful for the miserable freelance scraps my father-in-law threw my way. Today, I sat in the back of a black armored SUV, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settling over my chest. I was not the terrified, battered wife Bradley thought he could control. I was an executioner on my way to deliver the final blow. The Montgomery building loomed ahead, a towering monument of glass and steel that projected immense wealth. It was all a mirage. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked straight through the revolving doors. The lobby security guard, a man who used to make me wait 10 minutes before granting me a guest pass, stood up abruptly. He opened his mouth to stop me, but the 2 massive Croft security contractors, walking a step behind me, made him freeze. I bypassed the reception desk entirely and stepped into the private executive elevator. I pressed the button for the top floor. When the elevator doors slid open, I did not wait for the receptionist to announce me. I walked straight down the plush-carpeted hallway toward the main boardroom. I could hear their voices before I even reached the heavy oak doors. Laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, the unmistakable sound of arrogant men celebrating a victory they had not actually earned. I pushed the double doors open. The heavy wood swung inward with a loud thud, cutting their laughter short. The boardroom was a stereotypical display of corporate excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline. Winston sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a freshly lit cigar resting in an ashtray next to a glass of bourbon. Bradley was lounging in a leather chair, with his feet propped up on the table, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Terence stood near the window, his posture radiating the confident superiority of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Well, well, well," Winston said, a wide predatory smile spreading across his face. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence. I was beginning to wonder if we would have to send the bank executives directly to your fancy new office." Bradley dropped his feet from the table and leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. "You look stressed, Hannah. Did your elite lawyers tell you the bad news? That signature of yours is airtight. You are officially on the hook for every single penny this company owes. I bet that Croft money is burning a hole in your pocket right now." I stood near the entrance, my face a mask of absolute calm. I did not say a word. I just watched them gloat, letting them dig their own graves a little deeper. Terence walked over to the table and picked up a manila folder, the same one he had weaponized at the Plaza Hotel the night before. He tapped it against his palm, his expression dripping with condescension. "You have to understand business, Hannah. It is nothing personal. We built this logistics empire from the ground up, and we are not going to let a temporary market downturn destroy our legacy. You have the capital we need. We have the legal leverage to take it from you. But we are reasonable men. We do not need to drag this out in federal court and ruin the pristine reputation of Croft Holdings." Winston took a slow sip of his bourbon. "We are willing to make this very easy for you, Hannah. We will shred the guarantor forms right here, right now, in front of your eyes. All you have to do is authorize a one-time settlement transfer to our corporate accounts. We consider it a retroactive payment for all the years we fed and clothed you when you were nothing but a pathetic stray." "And how much is this generous settlement?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. $50 million, Winston stated, leaning back in his chair with absolute arrogance. 50 million, and you get to walk out of here without the burden of our corporate debt. You buy your freedom, and we save our company. Everyone wins." Bradley smirked, adjusting his cuffs. "Think of it as your final contribution to the family, darling. It is a bargain, really. You get to keep your fancy new title, and we do not bankrupt your daddy's empire. I looked at the three of them. Winston the tyrant, who cared only about his image. Bradley, the weak, abusive husband, who hid behind his father's money. Terence, the cunning financial architect, who thought he was the smartest man in the room. They actually believed they had backed me into a corner. They thought they were holding a gun to my head. They did not realize the weapon was completely empty. I slowly walked away from the doorway. I reached out and grabbed the brass handles of the heavy oak doors. With a firm, deliberate motion, I pulled them shut. The heavy metallic click of the locks turning echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. Winston frowned his cigar, pausing halfway to his mouth. "What are you doing?" I ignored him. I walked straight to the main media console at the side of the room. I pulled the encrypted flash drive from my pocket and plugged it directly into the system. The lights in the boardroom automatically dimmed. A mechanical hum filled the air as the massive projector screen descended from the ceiling, illuminating the dark room with a glaring, harsh white light. Terence narrowed his eyes, taking a step toward me. "Hannah, we do not have time for presentations. The banks open in an hour. You either authorize the $50 million transfer or I make the call that ruins you." I turned to face them, the glowing light of the projector casting long shadows across the room. I looked directly into Terence's eyes, watching the false bravado mask the panic he was trying so desperately to hide. "I am not here to negotiate, Winston," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority. "I am here to show you who has been stealing from you." I tapped the spacebar on my laptop. The massive projector screen behind me flickered, displaying a dense, color-coded financial spreadsheet. It was the internal master ledger for Montgomery Logistics, the one Terence kept buried beneath layers of encrypted corporate firewalls. "What is this garbage?" Bradley spat, squinting at the screen. "Are you trying to bore us to death with fake spreadsheets?" I ignored him and kept my eyes locked on Terence. The color had completely drained from the chief financial officer's face. His hands were gripping the edge of the conference table so hard, his knuckles were turning white. He recognized the spreadsheet immediately. For the past 3 years, Winston has been blaming a weak economy for the collapse of this company, I began, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "You laid off hundreds of warehouse workers. You cut benefits. You told your shareholders that the international shipping market was drying up. But the market did not bankrupt you, Winston. Your own son-in-law did." I pressed another key. The screen zoomed in on a series of highlighted red transactions. "I mapped your accounts payable against your international vendor invoices," I explained, pointing to the screen. "Between January of last year and this morning, Montgomery Logistics wired exactly $12 million to 5 different maritime shipping vendors based in the Caribbean. The only problem is, those vendors do not own a single cargo ship. They do not own warehouses. They do not even have physical offices." Terence swallowed hard. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "They are shell companies," I stated flatly. "Corporate ghosts registered to a single post office box in the Cayman Islands. And if you follow the routing numbers on those wire transfers, the money does not go to shipping ports. It goes directly into 3 private holding accounts managed by a blind trust." Winston turned his head slowly, looking at Terence. His voice was dangerously low. "Terence, what is she talking about?" Terence held up his hands, plastering on a fake, patronizing smile. "Winston, please. This is ridiculous. She is a freelance consultant who barely knows how to balance a checkbook. She hacked into our system and manipulated the data to create a distraction. Those are legitimate international logistics contracts. I can pull the physical invoices from my office right now." I tapped the keyboard again. Side by side, on the giant screen, the banking registration documents for the Cayman Shell Companies appeared. "You do not need to go to your office, Terence," I said. "I already pulled the registration documents for those holding accounts. They are masked by a proxy firm, but the primary beneficiary listed on every single one of them is you. You used the failing market as a smokescreen to embezzle $12 million from your own father-in-law." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Winston stared at the documents on the screen, his mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. The man he had trusted with the keys to his empire had been bleeding him dry. Bradley jumped up from his chair, pointing an accusing finger at Terrence. "You stole from us! You piece of garbage! You stole from my family!" Terrence backed away from the table, his arrogant facade completely shattering. "Bradley, shut up. You do not understand high-level corporate finance. This was a tax mitigation strategy. We needed liquid capital moved offshore to avoid the IRS audits. I was protecting the company." "Liar!" A sharp, frantic voice echoed from the back of the room. Penelope had been sitting quietly in the corner of the boardroom the entire time, filing her nails and waiting for me to be kicked out. Now she stormed forward, placing herself squarely between Terrence and her furious father. Her designer dress swished around her ankles as she glared at me with pure venom. "Do not listen to her, Dad!" Penelope screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She is trying to tear our family apart because she is bitter that Bradley is dumping her. Terrence would never steal from us. He is loyal." I looked at my sister-in-law with a mixture of pity and disgust. I pressed one final key on my laptop. The screen shifted from banking documents to a series of high-resolution property deeds and real estate purchasing agreements. "I am glad you brought up loyalty, Penelope," I said, "because it takes a very loyal wife to help her husband launder stolen corporate funds through illicit real estate." Penelope froze. The blood rushed to her face, turning her cheeks a blotchy, panicked red. I pulled up the property records for 6 luxury condominiums in Manhattan and 2 beachfront villas in Miami. I continued reading the addresses aloud. All purchased in cash over the last 24 months. All registered under a limited liability company that lists Penelope Montgomery as the sole proprietor. You knew exactly what Terrence was doing. You helped him hide the money. Winston gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his chest heaving as he stared at his own daughter, Penelope. He gasped, his voice trembling with a mixture of heartbreak and pure rage. "Tell me this is a lie. Tell me you did not conspire with this thief to ruin me." Penelope burst into tears, but they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of furious, entitled resentment. "Why should not I have taken the money?" Penelope shrieked, slamming her hands down on the table. "You gave everything to Bradley. You made him vice president just because he is your son, even though he is a complete idiot who spends half his day drinking and playing golf. Terrence does all the actual work to keep this company afloat. We deserved that money. We earned it. You were going to leave the entire legacy to Bradley anyway. We just took our share early." The confession hung in the air, toxic and heavy. The fragile high society illusion of the Montgomery family had been completely obliterated. They were not elite aristocrats. They were greedy, backstabbing criminals, willing to destroy their own flesh and blood for a payout. Winston let out a guttural roar that sounded more animal than human. The ultimate betrayal from his own daughter and his trusted CFO snapped the last thread of his sanity. He did not call for security. He did not threaten to sue. Winston lunged entirely across the massive mahogany boardroom table. Papers and crystal glasses flew everywhere as Winston tackled Terrence to the ground. The 2 men crashed into the floor in a tangle of expensive suits and flying fists. Winston grabbed Terrence by the collar of his custom shirt, punching him repeatedly in the face while screaming curses. Bradley, fueled by a mixture of shock and sheer manic rage, jumped into the fray, kicking Terrence in the ribs, while Penelope shrieked and tried to pull her brother away. I stood perfectly still by the projector, watching the wealthy, powerful Montgomery men tear each other apart like wild dogs over a scrap of meat. I did not try to stop them. I just calmly reached into my pocket and pressed a button on a small remote. The heavy oak boardroom doors, which I had locked from the inside, suddenly clicked and swung wide open. My Croft security contractors stepped aside, making way for the flood of new arrivals. A dozen federal agents in dark windbreakers poured into the room, their badges shining under the harsh fluorescent lights. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived. The federal agents moved with terrifying efficiency. They flooded the boardroom, their heavy boots trampling over the shattered crystal and scattered financial documents. Two agents immediately grabbed Winston by the shoulders, pulling the furious patriarch off his son-in-law. Bradley stumbled backward, wiping blood from his knuckles, as three more agents pinned Terrence face down against the mahogany floor. "Terrence Montgomery, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering," the lead agent announced, his voice echoing over the chaos. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Terrence thrashed against the agents, his custom suit tearing at the seam. "This is a mistake!" Terrence yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "I am the chief financial officer. I was authorized to move those funds. Winston, tell them I was operating under your directives." But Winston did not say a word. He stood against the floor-to-ceiling windows, breathing heavily, his face a mask of absolute horror and defeat. The man who had spent his entire life building an empire based on intimidation and arrogance was now watching it crumble into dust. As the agents hauled Terrence to his feet and snapped the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, Penelope finally realized the severity of the situation. Her pristine socialite facade shattered completely. She lunged forward, grabbing the lead agent's arm, her designer heels slipping on the spilled bourbon. "You cannot take him!" Penelope shrieked, her voice shrill and hysterical. "We are the Montgomery family. Do you know who we are? You cannot just walk in here and arrest my husband." The agent gently but firmly detached her hands from his jacket. "Ma'am, I suggest you step back. Furthermore, you should be advised that the FBI has officially frozen all bank accounts and real estate holdings registered under your limited liability company. Your assets are currently under federal investigation." Penelope let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. The realization that her illicit luxury apartments and stolen millions were gone hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled out of the boardroom and into the hallway, collapsing against the plush carpet. She buried her face in her hands, wailing loudly about her ruined reputation and her frozen credit cards. Her cries echoed down the empty corridor, a pathetic end to her reign of cruelty. The agents marched Terrence out the door, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Winston sank into a nearby chair, burying his head in his hands. He looked like a broken, hollow shell of a man. The great Montgomery logistics empire was dead, and the family was headed for federal prison. I stood quietly by the projector watching the scene unfold. I had executed my father's plan flawlessly. I had dismantled the people who had abused me for 5 years. The job was done. But then, a strange sound broke the heavy silence of the ruined boardroom. It started as a low chuckle. Then it grew louder, echoing off the glass walls. I turned my head and saw Bradley standing near the toppled leather chairs. He was not crying. He was not panicking like his father or his sister. He was straightening his ruined tie, brushing the dust off his jacket and laughing. It was a manic, arrogant laugh that sent a chill down my spine. Bradley walked slowly toward the center of the room, stepping right over the financial documents that had just sent his brother-in-law to jail. He looked at his father, who was still weeping silently in the corner, and rolled his eyes in disgust. "You think you won, Hannah?" Bradley asked, a cruel, wicked smile spreading across his face. "You think you really did something here today?" I kept my expression perfectly neutral. "Your company is bankrupt, Bradley. Your brother-in-law is facing 15 years in federal prison. Your sister is penniless in the hallway, and by tomorrow morning the media will have a field day with your family name." "I do not think I won. I know I did." Bradley let out another sharp bark of laughter. He walked right up to me, stopping just inches away. He did not look like a man who had just lost everything. He looked like a man holding a winning lottery ticket. "You can have this pathetic company," Bradley whispered, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. You can have the broken logistics contracts. You can deal with the angry vendors and the federal agents. I do not care about Montgomery Logistics. I never cared about this boring, failing business. Winston raised his head, looking at his son in utter shock. Bradley? What are you saying? We have lost everything. I am saying we do not need her, Bradley snapped, glaring at his father. We do not need her money, and we do not need her bailout. He turned his attention back to me, looking me up and down with absolute contempt. For 5 years, I had to pretend to love you. I had to sleep next to a cold, barren woman who could not even give me a child. You were a useless, empty vessel, Hannah. But you served your purpose. You kept my father off my back while I secured my real future. I did not flinch, though his words were designed to cut deep. During our marriage, Bradley had constantly blamed me for our inability to conceive, sending me to endless fertility clinics and making me feel like a broken woman to hide his own insecurities. Bradley pulled his phone from his pocket. He tapped the screen and held it up right in front of my face. The image displayed was a photograph of a newborn baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. "Meet my son, Bradley," sneered his voice, dripping with triumphant venom. "My mistress Monique just gave birth to him at a private clinic exactly 2 hours ago. A perfectly healthy baby boy. The first true Montgomery grandson." Winston gasped, grabbing the edge of the table. "A grandson? Are you serious?" Bradley smiled wildly at his father, then looked dead into my eyes. "That is right, Hannah. My grandfather was a smart man. He knew this logistics company might fail one day, so he set up the Montgomery Generation Skipping Trust Fund, $500 million in liquid assets, locked away in an untouchable offshore vault, and that trust fund has exactly one condition for release. It unlocks the very second the first male heir of my generation is born." Bradley took a step back, spreading his arms wide like a victorious king. "You can keep your little Croft empire. You can keep this bankrupt building. I do not need you. My son was just born, which means I am walking out of here today with $500 million. We are untouchable." 2 days passed since the federal agents raided the logistics headquarters. The media had completely eviscerated the Montgomery name. Their corporate empire was in ruins, but the men of the family still walked into the elite downtown law firm that morning with their heads held high. They were battered and facing federal indictments, but they genuinely believed they had found their ultimate escape hatch. The air inside the plush conference room smelled of expensive leather and desperate greed. Winston sat near the window, looking like a man who had narrowly survived a firing squad. The past 48 hours had aged him a decade, but right now his eyes were locked onto a sleeping newborn baby like it was a winning lottery ticket. Bradley sat next to his father, looking completely unbothered by the fact that his brother-in-law was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. Next to him was Monique, his mistress. She wore a tight designer dress that screamed of newly anticipated wealth, and she was cradling the infant, wrapped in a pristine white cashmere blanket. I sat directly across from them at the massive glass conference table. As the chief executive officer of Croft Holdings and a major shareholder connected to the liquidation of their corporate assets, my elite legal team had secured my right to audit this specific proceeding. The Generation Skipping Trust Fund represented a massive shift in capital, and I was not about to let them walk away with $500 million without being present for the final transaction. Bradley noticed me watching them and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "It must absolutely kill you to sit there and watch this," he sneered, leaning across the polished glass. "You orchestrated this massive corporate takeover. You thought you had completely destroyed us, but you forgot that my grandfather was smarter than you." The Generation Skipping Trust had been set up decades ago to avoid corporate taxation and protect the family wealth from exactly the kind of disastrous mismanagement Winston had caused. $500 million in untouchable offshore liquid assets. The only key required to unlock that vault was the birth of a male heir in the new generation. Monique adjusted the baby in her arms and glared at me with blatant, entitled superiority. She clearly thought she had just won the ultimate prize. "Bradley told me how bitter you always were," Monique said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It is a tragedy, really. You have all that Croft money now, but you could never give him the one thing that actually mattered. Some women just are not meant to be mothers." Bradley smirked, wrapping an arm around Monique's shoulders. He pulled her close and kissed her cheek, making sure I saw every second of the performance. "For 5 years, I had to deal with a cold, broken wife," Bradley said, his voice loud enough for the lawyers at the other end of the room to hear. "Do you remember all those clinic visits, Hannah? All those expensive treatments we paid for? Just to find out you were completely barren? A genetic dead end?" It is actually poetic that the woman you tried to replace is the one securing the future of this family. My chest tightened, but I kept my face perfectly blank. For 5 years, Bradley had marched me into sterile, freezing clinic rooms. He made me undergo countless invasive fertility treatments, watching me cry over negative test results month after month. He would coldly tell me that my body was defective. He had systematically gaslit me, convincing me that my inability to give him a child was my greatest failure as a human being. He used my grief to break down my self-esteem and keep me compliant. Now he was using this newborn baby to twist the knife one last time. Winston chimed in, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He desperately needed this trust fund to pay off his mounting legal fees and avoid federal prison. "She saved this family," Winston declared, nodding approvingly at Monique. "The Montgomery bloodline continues, and the legacy is secure. We do not need a single dime of your corporate bailout, Hannah." I did not react to their cruelty. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the table. My father had taught me a very specific lesson about business. The best time to strike an enemy is when they are completely blinded by their own arrogant joy. Let them climb to the very top of the pedestal before you kick it out from under them. The senior partner of the law firm, Mr. Kensington, entered the room, carrying a thick leather binder. He adjusted his glasses and took his seat at the head of the table. He was a meticulous man who operated strictly by the book. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Kensington said, opening the binder and arranging the documents in front of him. "We are here to execute the unsealing of the Montgomery Generation Skipping Trust. I have reviewed the stipulations set forth by the late founder. The requirement for the release of the $500 million principal is the verified birth of a male heir to the current generation." He picked up a certified document from the stack. "I have the official birth certificate right here. It lists the child as male, and it clearly lists Bradley Montgomery as the biological father. Everything appears to be in order. The stipulations of the trust have been fully met." Winston let out a massive, shuddering sigh of relief. He leaned back in his chair, a triumphant grin spreading across his wrinkled face. Bradley laced his fingers together behind his head, locking eyes with me like a victorious predator who had just cornered his prey. Monique smiled brightly, kissing the top of the baby's head. Mr. Kensington uncapped his heavy gold fountain pen. "I will now sign the release authorization," he announced, hovering the pen over the bottom line of the primary contract. "The funds will be transferred to a new holding account under Bradley's exclusive control within the hour." I pushed my chair back and stood up. The wooden legs of my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, cutting sharply through the celebratory silence in the room. Everyone froze. Bradley's smug smile faltered. Winston glared at me, annoyed by the interruption. Mr. Kensington stopped his gold pen hovering just an inch above the paper. "Before you sign that, Mr. Kensington," I said, my voice ringing out with a cold, terrifying authority, "there is a glaring legal irregularity regarding the beneficiary qualifications." I reached into my briefcase. I pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope marked with the red logo of a highly exclusive private medical clinic. I walked slowly to the head of the table and dropped the heavy file right on top of the trust documents, completely covering the signature line. Mr. Kensington jerked his hand back as if the manila envelope had caught fire. His heavy gold pen hovered in the air. Winston slammed his fist onto the glass table, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing. Bradley jumped out of his chair, pointing a shaking finger at me, shouting for security to remove me from the building immediately. I did not look at either of them. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the senior partner of the law firm. "Open it, Mr. Kensington," I commanded. My voice was calm, but held the absolute authority of the Croft bloodline. "You have a fiduciary duty to verify all beneficiary claims before releasing $500 million. If you sign that authorization without reviewing this evidence, Croft Holdings will personally see you disbarred for gross negligence and financial malpractice." Mr. Kensington swallowed hard. He looked at the screaming Montgomery men, then looked back at me. He set his gold pen down on the table. With careful, deliberate movements, he broke the red wax seal on the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of medical files. Bradley realized what was happening. He lunged across the table to grab the papers, but one of my security contractors stepped forward, placing a massive hand directly in the center of Bradley's chest and shoving him back into his leather chair. Bradley hit the seat hard, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. "Read the highlighted diagnosis on page 3, I instructed the lawyer. "Read it loud enough for the proud grandfather to hear." Mr. Kensington adjusted his glasses. He flipped to the 3rd page. The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence. Even the newborn baby in Monique's arms stopped fussing. "This is a certified medical report from the Premier Men Health Institute," Mr. Kensington read, his voice wavering slightly. "The patient listed is Bradley Montgomery. The date of the examination is exactly 4 years ago." Winston frowned, leaning closer. 4 years ago. What does an old medical report have to do with my grandson? "Keep reading," I said. Mr. Kensington cleared his throat. "The final diagnosis states that the patient suffers from non-obstructive azoospermia. The condition is congenital. The patient has an absolute 0 sperm count. He is completely and irreversibly sterile." The words hung in the air. They were heavy, clinical, and completely devastating. I watched Bradley shrink into his chair. For 4 years, he had known. He had gone to that private clinic behind my back after our first year of trying to conceive. He got the test results, saw that his genetics were the problem, and he buried the file. Instead of being honest with me, Bradley chose to protect his fragile, toxic ego. He let me believe my body was failing. He drove me to endless specialist appointments. He sat holding my hand in sterile waiting rooms while doctors injected me with hormones. He watched me cry myself to sleep month after month, devastated by negative pregnancy tests. He allowed his father and his sister to mock me at family dinners, calling me barren and useless. He let me carry the crushing weight of that shame, all to hide the fact that he was not half the man he pretended to be. Winston shook his head, a nervous laugh escaping his throat. "This is absurd. This is obviously a forgery. You fabricated this to stop the trust fund from unlocking." I smiled coldly. "Look at the bottom of the page, Mr. Kensington. Tell Winston whose signature is on that document." Mr. Kensington flipped to the last page. "It bears the certified signature of the Chief Medical Director along with a notarized seal from the State Health Board. It is completely authentic. Furthermore, the clinic has attached a signed affidavit verifying these results under penalty of perjury." Bradley jumped up again, his voice cracking with pure panic. "She paid them off. She used that Croft money to buy fake medical records. Dad, you cannot believe her. Look at my son. Look at him." Winston stared at Bradley. For the first time in his life, the tyrannical patriarch looked uncertain. The arrogant certainty that had defined the Montgomery legacy was fracturing right before my eyes. He looked at the certified seal on the medical document, then slowly turned his head to look at his son. Bradley Winston said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "Tell me right now, did you know about this? Are you sterile?" Bradley backed away from his father. "Dad, no, I swear, it is a lie. She is just trying to destroy me because I am leaving her for Monique." I did not argue with him. I did not need to. The truth was already settling over the room like a heavy winter frost. The medical records were irrefutable, and Winston was a man who understood the value of an airtight legal document. He knew I would never risk my own corporate standing by submitting forged medical records to a senior law partner. The implication of the zero sperm count diagnosis finally hit Winston with full force. If his son was completely incapable of fathering a child, then the baby currently wrapped in the white cashmere blanket could not possibly carry the Montgomery bloodline. The silence in the conference room became absolutely deafening. Winston slowly turned his head away from his panicked son. His cold, furious eyes locked directly onto the mistress sitting at the end of the table. Monique realized the trap had just snapped shut. The smug, victorious smile she had worn all morning completely vanished. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and terrified. She clutched the baby tightly to her chest, her eyes darting frantically around the room. Slowly, she took a step backward, trying to sneak toward the heavy glass doors. "Going somewhere, Monique?" I asked. My voice sliced through the heavy silence of the conference room. The two Croft security contractors stepped effortlessly in front of the heavy glass doors, crossing their muscular arms. Monique bumped into them, letting out a sharp, panicked gasp. She whipped around, her eyes darting wildly like a cornered animal. She clutched the cashmere blanket tighter against her chest, desperately trying to shield the infant from the crushing reality collapsing around her. Bradley slowly turned away from his father and looked at his mistress. The thick layer of denial that had been keeping him upright was rapidly evaporating. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of confusion and mounting rage. Monique Bradley said, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me that is my son." Monique opened her mouth, but only a desperate, pathetic stammer came out. "Bradley, baby, you know I love you. The clinic must have made a mistake. These corporate doctors mess up all the time. Miracles happen. We prayed for this baby." "Miracles require divine intervention," I said, stepping away from the table and walking slowly toward her. "What you required was a man with a functioning reproductive system. And since your wealthy meal ticket was firing blanks, you had to look elsewhere to secure your extravagant future." "That is a complete lie," Monique shrieked, backing away from me until she hit the broad chest of my security guard. "You are just a jealous, barren ex-wife making up stories to steal our money." "I am not the one who needs to steal," I replied, staring her down. I reached back into my briefcase. And I certainly do not need to make up stories when I have an elite private investigator on my payroll. I pulled out a second folder. This one was slim-bound in a crisp black cover. I tossed it onto the glass table, letting it slide right in front of Bradley. "For a woman trying to secure a $500 million trust fund, you were remarkably sloppy, Monique," I stated, making sure my voice carried to Winston, who was still frozen in shock at the head of the table. "You spent the last year pretending when this family had no heir. But once I moved out, Bradley still could not get you pregnant. You realized your window to lock down the Montgomery fortune was closing rapidly. So you got desperate." Bradley grabbed the black folder. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely open the cardboard flap. "I started having you followed 3 months ago," I explained, addressing the entire room. "My investigators noticed you were spending an awful lot of time at a cheap, run-down motel on the outskirts of the city. You were meeting a man there twice a week. A man Bradley actually knows quite well." Bradley stared at the first page of the document, his breath catching painfully in his throat. "It is a DNA paternity test," I said, looking directly at Bradley. "My team procured a discarded coffee cup from your former personal driver. You remember him, do you not, Bradley? The guy you fired last year for accidentally scratching the rim of your sports car? My investigator took a swab from that cup and cross-referenced it with a pacifier Monique threw away at a public park." Bradley let out a sound that resembled a dying animal. He dropped the paper onto the glass table as if it burned his fingers. Mr. Kensington, I instructed the senior partner. Please do the honors and read the results. The lawyer did not hesitate. He picked up the document, his professional demeanor entirely restored, now that he realized he had just narrowly avoided authorizing a massive financial crime. The genetic analysis, Mr. Kensington read loudly, his voice echoing off the walls, concludes a 99.9% probability that the subject, the former driver, is the biological father of the infant. No! Bradley screamed, lunging furiously at Monique. My security contractors instantly stepped between them, shoving Bradley back with brutal force. He hit the floor, scrambling backward, tearing at his own hair. The ultimate golden boy, the arrogant heir who had spent half a decade destroying my self-worth, was now sobbing hysterically on the carpet of a corporate law firm. His entire life was a carefully constructed lie, and I had just burned it to the ground. You used me, Bradley sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at the mother of the child. You filthy gold digger! You set me up! I used you, Monique spat back, her fake sweet persona entirely vanishing, her face contorted with vicious anger. You promised me a life of luxury. You told me you were a billionaire. You never told me your family company was going bankrupt, and you definitely never told me you were sterile. I had to secure the bag myself, because you are half a man. The sheer viciousness of her words hit Bradley like a physical blow. He curled in on himself, defeated and completely broken. The man who had slapped me in front of 500 guests was now weeping on the floor, emasculated by his own mistress. At the head of the table, Mr. Kensington snapped his thick leather binder shut with a resounding crack. He stood up, signaling aggressively to the other junior lawyers in the room. They immediately began packing their briefcases in absolute synchronization. Winston, Mr. Kensington said, his voice stripped of any previous courtesy or respect. This constitutes a deliberate, calculated attempt to defraud a generation-skipping trust. As the executors of this estate, my firm is legally obligated to freeze the $500 million principal indefinitely, pending a full federal review. We are withdrawing as your legal counsel, effective immediately. Expect to hear from the authorities by the end of the day. The lawyers marched out of the room, their briefcases swinging decisively by their sides. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them. The $500 million lifeline was gone. It was officially locked away, completely out of reach for the rest of their miserable lives. Winston Montgomery stood up from his chair. His face was a ghastly, pale gray. He looked at the closed door, then at his weeping son on the floor, and finally at me. He opened his mouth to speak, to hurl one last insult, to demand the respect he felt he was owed. Instead, his eyes rolled back into his head. He let out a sharp gasp and grabbed the center of his chest, his fingers digging into his expensive tailored suit. His knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed heavily into the leather chair. His breathing turned into shallow, ragged wheezes. The immense stress, the public humiliation, and the absolute evaporation of his legacy had triggered a cardiac event. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the tyrannical patriarch, clutching his heart in the ruins of his own arrogance. The heavy glass doors of the conference room remained firmly shut, trapping the Montgomery family in a nightmare entirely of their own making. Winston slumped sideways in his leather chair. His face was a terrifying shade of gray as he clutched his chest, gasping for shallow, ragged breaths. A junior legal assistant who had been left behind frantically pulled out a cell phone and dialed for paramedics. But Bradley did not even look at his dying father. The golden boy of the Montgomery Empire was entirely consumed by the destruction of his own ego. He scrambled off the carpet, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. He lunged toward Monique, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You lying parasite!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking violently. "You let me believe I was a father. You let me bring you into this room to claim $500 million, knowing exactly whose child you were carrying. Monique did not cower. The sweet, submissive mistress act evaporated completely. She held the baby tighter and glared at Bradley with absolute disgust. "Do not play the victim with me," Bradley Monique shouted right back. "You promised me a billionaire lifestyle. You promised me penthouses and private jets. You never told me your father was driving the company into the ground, and you certainly never told me you were shooting blanks. I did what I had to do to survive. You are not a victim. You are just a broke, sterile loser who got outplayed." The absolute cruelty of her words hit Bradley like a freight train. He staggered backward, knocking over a stack of water glasses. They shattered across the mahogany table, but nobody cared. Bradley grabbed his own hair, letting out a raw, humiliating sob. He had lost his wife. He had lost his company. He had lost his inheritance. And now he had lost his very manhood in front of a room full of people. I stood by the window watching the chaos unfold with absolute detachment. 5 years ago, a scene like this would have broken my heart. I would have tried to comfort him. I would have tried to fix it. But today, I felt absolutely nothing. The man crying on the floor was a stranger to me. He was a weak, abusive coward who was finally facing the consequences of his own toxic arrogance. I turned to my security contractors and gave a brief nod. My work here was done. I stepped over the shattered glass and walked calmly toward the heavy oak doors. I did not look back at Winston gasping for air. I did not look back at Bradley weeping on the carpet. I walked out of the conference room and let the heavy doors click shut behind me, sealing them in their custom-built tomb. The lobby of the elite law firm was completely silent. The paralegals and receptionists stared at me as I walked past, their eyes wide with awe and fear. They had just witnessed a freelance consultant transform into the undisputed CEO of Croft Holdings and bring down a century-old corporate dynasty in a single afternoon. I did not stop to chat. I walked straight into the private elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. When I stepped out of the high-rise building and onto the bustling city sidewalk, the crisp afternoon air felt incredible. It smelled like freedom. My black armored SUV was idling by the curb. My driver stood by the open rear door, waiting patiently for my arrival. I took a deep breath, ready to leave the Montgomery family behind forever. "Hannah, wait! Please wait!" The shrill, desperate voice echoed down the concrete sidewalk. I turned my head and saw a woman running frantically toward me. It took me a second to even recognize her. It was Penelope, my arrogant, vicious sister-in-law. She looked absolutely horrific. The pristine socialite who had mocked my clothing at the Plaza Hotel just days ago was entirely gone. Her designer dress was wrinkled and stained. Her expensive hair extensions were tangled and matted. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. She looked like a woman who had just survived a shipwreck. And in a way, she had. When the federal agents arrested Terrence for wire fraud and embezzlement, they did not just take him away in handcuffs. They immediately froze every single bank account, credit card, and offshore trust registered to his name. And because Penelope had foolishly allowed Terrence to put the illicit real estate holding companies in her name, the FBI had frozen all of her personal assets as well. She was completely penniless. Penelope practically threw herself at my feet, grabbing the sleeve of my custom blazer. Her hands were shaking violently. "Hannah, please," Penelope sobbed, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "You have to help me. They took everything. The bank cards will not even buy a cup of coffee. The feds locked me out of my own penthouse. I have nowhere to go. I need a lawyer to keep me out of federal prison, but no one will take my calls without a retainer." I looked down at the woman who had spent 5 years treating me like a stray dog. "You are asking me for money, Penelope?" I asked, my voice calm and completely void of sympathy. "You are the CEO of Croft Holdings now," Penelope begged, tears streaming down her blotchy face. "You have billions. You can afford the best defense attorneys in the country. Terrence made me sign those property deeds. I did not know the money was stolen. Please, Hannah, we are family. You cannot just leave me out here on the street. I stared at her for a long, quiet moment. I thought about all the family dinners where she had intentionally humiliated me. I thought about the time she told me to take the service elevator to the alley where I belonged. I slowly reached into my designer handbag. I opened my wallet. Penelope stared at my hands, her eyes wide with desperate, pathetic hope. She really believed that playing the family card would suddenly erase 5 years of relentless emotional abuse. I pulled out a single, crisp $20 bill. I held it out. Penelope looked at the $20 bill, then looked up at me, absolute confusion washing over her tear-stained face. "What is this?" Penelope whispered. I dropped the $20 bill directly onto the concrete sidewalk at her feet. "That is for a taxicab," I said, looking her dead in the eyes. "Take it to the nearest courthouse and ask for a public defender. Good luck with the federal indictment, Penelope." I turned my back on her and stepped into the plush interior of my armored SUV. The driver firmly shut the heavy door, cutting off the sound of Penelope wailing on the sidewalk. As the powerful engine roared to life and the vehicle pulled smoothly into the city traffic, I did not look out the tinted window. I simply leaned back against the leather seat and told my driver to take me back to headquarters. The real work was just beginning. Winston sat in the back of a heavily tinted private town car, his hand clutching his chest. The sharp, terrifying pain of the mild cardiac event had finally begun to subside, replaced by a cold, adrenaline-fueled instinct for sheer survival. He had refused medical attention at the law firm. He knew that checking into a hospital meant registering his location in a central database, effectively making himself a sitting duck for federal agents. While Bradley was still on the floor screaming at Monique, and the lawyers were scrambling to contain the fallout, Winston had quietly slipped out the back exit of the high-rise building. He stared out the window at the passing city skyline, his breathing ragged but steadying. His entire legacy was dead. The massive logistics empire he had spent 40 years building with ruthless intimidation was currently being ripped apart by forensic accountants and the FBI. The generation-skipping trust, his final $500 million lifeline, was locked away in a legal vault forever. And it was all because his golden boy turned out to be a sterile, arrogant fool who got outplayed by a desperate mistress and a brilliant undercover heiress. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with terrifying clarity. Terrence was already in federal custody. Winston knew exactly how high-profile white-collar crime investigations operated. The federal prosecutors would lean heavily on Terrence, threatening him with decades behind bars. And Terrence, desperate to save his own skin, would flip immediately. The chief financial officer would hand the prosecution every single illegal tax evasion strategy, every hidden corporate ledger, and every offshore account Winston had ever authorized. By tomorrow morning, the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission would freeze every domestic asset tied to the Montgomery name. Arrest warrants would be issued. Winston was staring down the barrel of a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. He would die in a concrete cell, stripped of his dignity and his bespoke suits. But Winston was a survivor. He had not built an empire by fighting losing battles. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a prepaid burner phone, a device he kept strictly for off-the-books emergencies. He dialed a number he had memorized years ago. It belonged to an elite aviation broker who specialized in discreet, untraceable travel for clients who needed to disappear. Winston demanded a long-range private jet ready on the tarmac at a secluded airfield in New Jersey by midnight. He requested a flight plan routed straight to a specific nation in South America, a country that conveniently lacked an extradition treaty with the United States government. The broker demanded an exorbitant premium for the extreme short notice and the high legal risk. Winston agreed without a second of hesitation. He leaned forward and instructed his loyal driver to head to the financial district. The town car navigated through the heavy afternoon traffic, eventually pulling into a dimly lit, heavily fortified underground parking garage. It was a private maximum security storage facility, utilized by the ultra-wealthy to hide physical assets from subpoenas, aggressive tax audits, and messy divorces. Winston bypassed the front reception desk, using a biometric retinal scanner to access the subterranean vault levels. He walked quickly down the silent, climate-controlled corridor. His chest still felt incredibly tight, but raw panic drove his feet forward. He reached his designated vault and punched a complex alphanumeric code into the digital keypad. The heavy steel door hissed as the pressurized seal broke, swinging outward to reveal a small, sterile room. Inside sat a single, reinforced titanium safe. Winston unlocked it and pulled out a heavy black leather briefcase. He set it on a small metal table and popped the brass latches. Inside the briefcase were pristine stacks of high-yield bearer bonds. They were completely untraceable physical financial instruments, as good as cash, but much easier to transport. Nestled beside the bonds was a velvet pouch filled with certified investment-grade diamonds. The contents of the briefcase totaled exactly $5 million. It was a pathetic, microscopic fraction of the billionaire lifestyle he was accustomed to. However, in a developing country with a low cost of living and absolutely no federal agents, $5 million was more than enough to buy a comfortable, quiet retirement in the sun. As he closed the briefcase and locked the latches, his regular personal cell phone began to vibrate violently in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. He had 14 missed calls from Penelope and 22 text messages from Bradley. The messages previewing on his screen were completely frantic. Penelope was begging for a lawyer, screaming in all caps that the feds had locked her out of her penthouse and her credit cards were declining on the sidewalk. Bradley was demanding his father come back to the law firm immediately, crying that his life was completely ruined and asking what they were going to do next to fix the mess. Winston stared at the desperate messages from his children. He felt a fleeting microscopic second of parental guilt, but it was instantly swallowed by cold, hard pragmatism. Bradley was weak. He was a fragile, sterile coward who had brought the Croft heiress right into their home and handed her the keys to their destruction. Penelope was a foolish, greedy child who had carelessly put illicit real estate in her own name. They were the ones responsible for this spectacular collapse. They were dead weight. And Winston knew that a man carrying dead weight would surely drown. He powered down his personal cell phone, rendering his location completely untraceable. He walked out of the vault and dropped the device directly into a heavy metal trash can in the corridor. Winston gripped the handle of the briefcase containing his $5 million escape fund. He squared his shoulders, ignoring the dull ache in his chest. He turned his back on his former life and walked toward his waiting car to catch his midnight flight, fully prepared to leave his son and daughter behind to face the crushing weight of federal prison entirely alone. The sun was setting over the Manhattan skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor of my new corner office at Croft Holdings. The city below was completely oblivious to the financial massacre that had just taken place, but the corporate world was already panicking. News of the FBI raid at Montgomery Logistics and the freezing of their $500 million trust fund had spread through the financial district like wildfire. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the brake lights of the evening traffic. I knew exactly what Winston was doing right now. For 5 years, I had sat quietly at their extravagant family dinners, listening to Winston preach about loyalty, legacy, and the unbreakable bond of the Montgomery bloodline. But I had also reviewed his private behavioral profiles. I knew that beneath the custom-tailored suits and the booming voice, my father-in-law was a coward. He was a man who demanded absolute sacrifice from everyone around him, but would happily throw his own children to the wolves to save himself. I knew he would not stay to fight the federal indictments. I knew he would run. And I had been preparing for his escape for the last 6 months. The heavy glass door of my office clicked open. Bennett, The ruthless director of acquisitions for Croft Holdings walked in, carrying a towering stack of thick, red-tagged legal folders. He set them down on my massive obsidian desk with a heavy thud. The financial sector is in absolute freefall over the Montgomery collapse, Bennett reported, adjusting his tie with a satisfied smile. Every major bank on the East Coast just realized that the Montgomery corporate guarantees are completely worthless. Their stock has flatlined, and the banks are desperate to offload any toxic personal debt associated with the family before the federal government starts seizing assets for restitution. I turned away from the window and walked toward the desk. Excellent. Are the contracts prepared? Bennett nodded, opening the first red folder. Every single one of them. We moved exactly as you instructed. When a high-profile billionaire faces sudden federal indictment, their personal debt becomes a massive liability for the banks that financed their lavish lifestyle. The banks panic. They want to scrub their books clean of the toxic loans before the government steps in. And when banks panic, they sell that debt on the secondary market for pennies on the dollar to anyone with enough liquid capital to take the risk. Croft Holdings had more liquid capital than the next 3 investment banks combined. While Winston was busy scurrying through underground vaults to scrape together his pathetic $5 million escape fund, I was using the unlimited power of my true family empire to legally purchase every single shred of debt the Montgomery family owed. I picked up my customized fountain pen. I did not just want to freeze their accounts. I wanted to own them. I opened the first file. It contained the mortgage deed to the sprawling $20 million triplex penthouse Bradley lived in. For 5 years, Bradley had forced me to live in a modest, cramped townhome under the guise of teaching me financial responsibility, while he secretly maintained this luxurious penthouse to entertain his mistresses and host his lavish parties. He always bragged that his name was on the deed. He was right. But as of today, the bank no longer held the mortgage. I did. I signed my name on the bottom line with a swift, aggressive stroke. With that single signature, I became Bradley's sole creditor. I legally owned the roof over his head. I owned the floors he walked on. I had the absolute legal authority to evict him with 0 notice due to the default clauses triggered by his impending federal fraud charges. I pushed the folder aside and opened the next one. This file contained the financing agreements for the Montgomery family fleet of luxury vehicles. The customized sports cars Bradley paraded around the city. The armored SUVs Winston used to intimidate his rivals. The sleek, imported convertibles Penelope drove to her exclusive country clubs. The banks had financed all of them, based on the inflated corporate equity Terrence had fabricated. I signed the transfer agreements one by one. I was now the legal owner of every single vehicle they possessed. I could have them towed and impounded before midnight. File after file, I systematically purchased their entire existence. I bought the liens on Penelope's remaining offshore properties that the FBI had not yet seized. I bought the debt on Winston's exclusive country club memberships. I bought the outstanding invoices for Bradley's custom tailors. I stripped away every single layer of their affluent, untouchable facade, transferring absolute ownership of their lives directly into my hands. Bennett slid the final thickest folder toward me. He tapped his finger against the heavy cardstock cover. "This is the one you requested specific priority on," Bennett said, his eyes gleaming with professional admiration. "The Aviation Holding Company." I opened the folder. Inside was the financing contract for the Montgomery family's private Gulfstream jet, along with the master lease for their private hangar at the secluded New Jersey airfield. Winston thought he was a mastermind for keeping his private jet registered under an independent aviation holding firm to avoid corporate taxes. He thought it made the aircraft untraceable to the federal agents raiding his logistics headquarters. He was right about the feds, but he was entirely wrong about me. I had tracked the tail number of that jet months ago. I knew exactly which bank held the massive loan on the aircraft. And because Winston had missed his last 2 maintenance payments while struggling with the company's cash flow, the jet was technically eligible for immediate repossession. I pressed my pen to the paper and signed my name on the final acquisition contract. "It is done," Bennett said, closing the folder and gathering the stack of documents. "The wire transfers have cleared. You are no longer just the former daughter-in-law, Hannah. You are legally the sole creditor and absolute owner of every single physical asset the Montgomery family possesses." I set my pen down on the desk. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. For 5 years they had looked down on me because they thought I owned nothing. Now they owned nothing. I checked the sleek silver watch on my wrist. It was approaching 11 o'clock at night. The storm outside was intensifying, rain lashing heavily against the thick glass windows of my office. "Winston is a creature of habit," I said, looking out at the dark, rain-soaked city. "He thinks he has outsmarted the federal government. He thinks he is going to board that plane and fly away to a sunny beach in South America, leaving his son and daughter to take the fall for his crimes." I picked up my coat and slipped it on, adjusting the collar with meticulous precision. "Tell the security detail to bring the vehicles around," I instructed Bennett. "Send the eviction team to Bradley's penthouse immediately, but have my personal driver head straight to the New Jersey airfield. Winston is about to find out exactly who owns the plane he is trying to escape on." Bradley Montgomery sat in the back of a yellow taxicab, staring blankly out the window. The rain was coming down in heavy, violent sheets across Manhattan, turning the city streets into a blurry sea of neon lights. He reeked of cheap whiskey and utter defeat. The past 48 hours had systematically stripped him of his title as vice president. It had stripped him of his $500 million generation-skipping trust fund. It had stripped him of his mistress, and it had stripped him of his manhood in front of a room full of elite corporate lawyers. But as the cab pulled up to his exclusive residential building on the Upper East Side, a weak, arrogant smirk temporarily returned to his bruised face. He still had his sanctuary. He still had his $20 million triplex penthouse. Hannah could take his family company, but his name was exclusively on this deed. He planned to lock the heavy mahogany doors, pour himself a massive glass of scotch, and figure out how to manipulate his father into fixing this monumental disaster. Bradley stumbled out of the cab, barely managing to hand a wad of crumpled cash to the driver. He turned toward the grand, marble-framed entrance of his luxury building, but his expensive leather shoe kicked something soft on the wet concrete. He looked down, blinking through the haze of alcohol and heavy rain. Sitting directly on the dirty, flooded sidewalk were dozens of heavy-duty black garbage bags. One of the bags had ripped open, completely saturated by the storm. Bradley stared in absolute disbelief. Spilling out onto the pavement were his custom-tailored Italian suits. His limited-edition golf clubs were stacked carelessly against a nearby trash can. The velvet display boxes containing his collection of imported luxury watches were tossed onto the curb empty and discarded in the mud. Bradley let out a furious, animalistic scream. He sprinted toward the revolving glass doors of the lobby, ready to throttle the concierge for allowing someone to vandalize his property. He was going to have the entire building staff fired by morning. He was going to sue the management company into oblivion. But as he burst through the doors, he froze in his tracks. The familiar, welcoming concierge was nowhere to be seen. Instead, 4 heavily armed private security contractors, wearing the Croft Holdings insignia, stood like stone statues across the lobby. They had completely barricaded the private elevators leading to the penthouse suites. "What is the meaning of this?" Bradley roared. His voice cracked as he marched up to the security perimeter, pointing a shaking finger at the guards. "Who authorized you to touch my things? Let me into my elevator right now. I own the penthouse in this building. I am a Montgomery." The lead security contractor, a massive man with a stoic expression, did not even flinch. He reached inside his tactical jacket and pulled out a stack of legal documents clipped to a heavy board. He held it up for Bradley to read. "You do not own anything anymore, Mr. Montgomery," the contractor stated firmly. "The bank sold the mortgage on your penthouse exactly 3 hours ago. You are currently in massive financial default due to the impending federal fraud indictments against your corporate assets. The new sole creditor of this property exercised an emergency repossession clause. You waived your standard eviction rights when you cross-collateralized this property with your failing logistics accounts. You are officially trespassing. Bradley snatched the paperwork from the guard's hands. His bloodshot eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, desperately looking for a loophole. But his gaze stopped dead at the bottom of the final page. There, signed in bold, aggressive black ink, was the name of the new property owner, Hannah Croft. The realization hit Bradley like a physical blow to the chest. She had not just frozen his corporate assets. She had gone to the secondary market and bought his personal debt for pennies on the dollar. She literally owned the roof over his head. She owned his cars. She owned his life. Bradley completely lost his mind. The alcohol, the humiliation, and the sheer shock boiled over into pure, unadulterated rage. He pounded his fists against the glass security barriers, screaming until his throat went raw. "You tell that vindictive witch she is not going to get away with this," Bradley shrieked, spit flying from his lips. "My father is Winston Montgomery. He has the most vicious legal defense team on the entire East Coast. He is going to drag Hannah into federal court and sue her for every single dime she has. We are going to tie her up in litigation for the next 10 years. She cannot do this to us. We will destroy her." The head of security looked at Bradley with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He did not argue with the hysterical man. He simply reached into his vest, pulled out a sleek digital tablet, and tapped the screen. He turned the device around and shoved it right in front of Bradley's flushed, angry face. Bradley squinted at the glowing screen. It was a live aviation tracking map. A single red dot was moving rapidly across the digital radar, heading south over the Atlantic Ocean. "Your father is not going to sue anyone," the security contractor said, his voice cold and flat. "That red dot is Winston's private Gulfstream jet. He liquidated a hidden art vault this afternoon and booked a midnight flight to a country with no extradition treaty. He is fleeing to South America right now. He shut off his phone and left you here to hold the bag for the entire corporate fraud investigation." Bradley stared at the little red dot moving further and further away on the screen. The arrogant threats died completely in his throat. The realization that his own father had sacrificed him to save himself shattered his final illusion of safety. His knees buckled and he collapsed right there on the polished marble floor of the lobby. He was homeless, penniless, facing imminent federal prison time, and entirely abandoned by the man he had spent his whole life trying to impress. The rain fell in violent, heavy sheets across the desolate runway of the private New Jersey airfield. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the dark, storm-soaked tarmac for brief, terrifying seconds. Inside the back of the sleek black town car, Winston Montgomery gripped the handle of his leather briefcase so tightly his knuckles were completely white. His breathing was shallow and ragged. The dull, persistent ache in the center of his chest was a constant reminder of the minor cardiac event he had suffered just hours earlier in the downtown law firm. He had refused to go to the hospital. He knew that the moment he checked into a medical facility, his name would be flagged in a central database, making him an incredibly easy target for the federal agents who were currently dismantling his entire corporate empire. Instead, he had chosen survival. Winston stared out the tinted window as the town car navigated the winding access road toward the private hangars. He felt a twisted, dark sense of pride swelling beneath his panic. His company was bankrupt. His son-in-law was sitting in a federal holding cell, facing decades in prison. His daughter was locked out of her penthouse, crying on the sidewalk with frozen credit cards. His son had been emasculated and stripped of his $500 million trust fund. They had all failed. But Winston was a survivor. He had not built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire by going down with a sinking ship. He had spent his entire life making ruthless, calculated decisions, and abandoning his family to face the federal fraud indictments alone was simply the final necessary business transaction. He looked down at the heavy black briefcase resting on his lap. Inside, sat $5 million in untraceable bearer bonds and investment-grade diamonds. It was a microscopic fraction of the massive wealth he was accustomed to commanding, but in the remote South American country he was fleeing, to a country that conveniently lacked an extradition treaty with the United States government, $5 million was more than enough to buy a sprawling estate, a new identity, and a very comfortable retirement. Winston let out a harsh, bitter laugh that turned into a wet cough. He thought about Bradley weeping on the carpet of the law firm. He thought about how weak his son truly was. Bradley had brought the undercover Croft heiress right into their home. Bradley had handed her the keys to their destruction because he was too arrogant to see the brilliance hiding behind her quiet, compliant facade. Winston felt absolutely no guilt about leaving his son behind to take the fall for the corporate fraud. A man carrying dead weight would inevitably drown. The town car finally rounded the last corner of the airfield and pulled up to the designated departure zone. Winston leaned forward, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There it was, sitting on the wet, glossy tarmac, was his private Gulfstream jet. The anti-collision lights were flashing brightly through the driving rain. The powerful twin engines were already whining with a low, steady roar, indicating that the pilots had completed their pre-flight checks and were ready for immediate departure. Winston felt a massive wave of absolute relief wash over him. He had actually done it. He had outsmarted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had outsmarted the Securities and Exchange Commission, and most importantly, he had outsmarted Hannah Croft. She might have frozen his bank accounts and destroyed his public reputation, but she had failed to trap him. He had purposely registered this private jet under a heavily masked, independent aviation holding company years ago to avoid corporate taxes. He knew the federal agents raiding his logistics headquarters would not immediately connect the aircraft to his personal assets. It was his ultimate, brilliant escape hatch. The driver parked the car near the base of the aircraft and quickly got out, opening an umbrella to shield Winston from the torrential downpour. Winston did not wait. He shoved the door open and stepped out into the freezing rain, ignoring the umbrella entirely. The wind whipped violently across the tarmac, soaking his custom-tailored suit in seconds. He did not care. He clutched his $5 million briefcase to his chest and marched purposefully toward the metal boarding stairs. The deafening roar of the jet engines drowned out the sound of the thunder. Winston reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up at the closed cabin door. Inside that jet was warmth, luxury, and absolute freedom. In less than 12 hours, he would be sipping premium rum on a private sun-drenched beach, thousands of miles away from the miserable wreckage of his family. He placed his expensive leather shoe on the first metal step. The surface was slick with rain, forcing him to grip the handrail tightly. He climbed the stairs with determined, heavy steps, his chest burning with exertion. Just a few more feet, just a few more seconds until he was completely untouchable. Winston reached the top platform. He stood in front of the sealed cabin door, shivering from the freezing rain, waiting for the flight attendant to unseal the latch and welcome him aboard. A loud mechanical hiss pierced through the noise of the storm. The heavy hydraulic seals of the aircraft door released. The thick metal door slowly swung outward, revealing the warm, golden light of the luxurious cabin interior. Winston took a step forward, a victorious smile finally breaking through his exhausted features. He looked up, expecting to see his regular pilot or a stewardess rushing forward to take his soaking wet coat, but the smile froze completely on his face. The air in his lungs vanished. Standing perfectly still at the top of the stairs, framed by the warm glow of the cabin lights, was Hannah. She was wearing a pristine, tailored designer coat, completely untouched by the violent storm raging outside. Her posture was relaxed, elegant, and entirely commanding. In her right hand, she casually held a crystal flute filled with expensive champagne. She looked down at the soaked, desperate, shivering man clutching a briefcase on the top step of the runway. She took a slow, deliberate sip from her glass, her eyes locked dead onto his terrified face. Winston stared up at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the freezing rain plastered his silver hair to his forehead. The deafening whine of the Gulfstream engines masked the heavy thud of his own heartbeat, but I could see the absolute terror vibrating through his chest. He blinked rapidly, desperately trying to compute how the undercover heiress he had abandoned to his corporate wreckage was now standing inside his ultimate escape hatch. Hannah Winston finally managed to shout over the roar of the storm. "What are you doing here? Get out of my way! This aircraft is registered to a private holding firm. You are trespassing on federal aviation property." He tried to push his way up the final step, acting on the sheer muscle memory of 40 years of corporate bullying. He actually thought he could just shoulder past me, order the pilots to take off, and leave me standing on the runway. I did not move an inch. I simply lowered my champagne flute and smiled. "Welcome to my jet, Winston," I said, projecting my voice clearly over the torrential rain. "The interior is lovely. I particularly like the mahogany paneling you chose." Winston froze, his expensive leather shoe slipping slightly on the wet metal stair. "What are you talking about?" "I seized the primary financing contract for this aircraft at 4 o'clock this afternoon," I explained, taking another slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. "You missed 2 consecutive maintenance escrow payments while you were desperately trying to cover Terrence and his offshore embezzlement. The bank triggered the repossession clause. Croft Holdings purchased the debt in full. I am the sole owner of this plane. My pilots are currently in the cockpit. We are not flying to South America tonight." "Winston, we are grounded." The reality of my words slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. Winston swayed on the top step, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the freezing metal handrail. He looked past me into the luxurious, brightly lit cabin, realizing that the warmth and freedom he had been craving was officially a mirage. The escape route was permanently sealed. But Winston was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always try to negotiate. He looked down at the heavy black leather briefcase clutched tightly against his soaked suit jacket. He took a ragged breath, trying to summon the commanding aura he had paraded around the Plaza Hotel just 2 nights ago. "Listen to me," Winston yelled over the storm, holding the briefcase up slightly. "I have $5 million right here. Untraceable bearer bonds and investment-grade diamonds. It is entirely off the books. No federal agent knows it exists. Let me get on this plane. Tell your pilots to file the flight plan. You can keep the entire briefcase. $5 million, Hannah, in pure liquid cash. Just let me walk away." I looked at the black leather briefcase. Then I looked back at the pathetic, shivering man offering me pocket change to save his own miserable life. He genuinely believed that the woman who commanded the multi-billion-dollar Croft empire would be swayed by $5 million of stolen scraps. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing right at the edge of the cabin door. "Winston," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy tone, "you could not afford to buy a second of my time if you liquidated your entire bloodline." Before he could react, I raised my foot and planted the sole of my designer pump squarely against the side of his heavy leather briefcase. With one sharp, aggressive thrust, I kicked the briefcase entirely out of his grip. "No, Winston!" screamed, lunging forward with a desperate, pathetic grasp. But he was too late. The briefcase tumbled backward down the slick metal boarding stairs, bouncing violently against the metal grating. The brass latches, already strained by his tight grip, snapped completely open on the third impact. The briefcase hit the wet, oily tarmac and burst wide open. Thick stacks of high-yield bearer bonds exploded onto the pavement. The torrential rain and violent runway winds instantly caught the paper, scattering millions of dollars across the dark airfield. The velvet pouch tore open, sending a shower of flawless investment-grade diamonds bouncing into the muddy, fuel-stained puddles beneath the aircraft tires. Winston watched in absolute paralyzing horror as his entire escape fund dissolved into wet garbage in a matter of seconds. He collapsed onto his knees on the freezing metal stairs. The sharp impact tore his tailored suit pants, but he did not feel it. The man who had spent his entire life building an empire of intimidation, who had demanded absolute subservience from his family, was now kneeling in the freezing rain, completely broken. He looked down at the ruined bonds floating in the muddy water, then slowly looked up at me. His arrogant pride had been entirely eradicated. There was nothing left but raw, suffocating panic. He grabbed the hem of my coat with trembling, soaked hands. "Hannah, please," Winston begged, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical sob. "Please, I am begging you. The FBI is going to put me in a concrete cell until I die. I will not survive federal prison. You cannot do this to me. I took you in when you had nothing. I gave you a home. We are family, Hannah. Please, show some mercy. We are family." I looked down at the weeping, pathetic patriarch clutching my coat. I thought about the 5 years I spent in his house, listening to him mock my intelligence. I thought about the night at the Plaza Hotel, where he proudly watched his son slap me across the face and led a ballroom of 500 guests in cruel laughter. He had never considered me family. I was just a target. I gently pulled the hem of my coat out of his grasping, trembling fingers. I looked down at him, my expression perfectly composed, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, magnificent satisfaction. "A prestigious family," I said, repeating the exact words he had used to humiliate me in front of the entire New York high society, "should know how to pay its own bills. A prestigious family should know how to pay its own bills." I let the words hang in the freezing air. Winston stared up at me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. The rain battered his face, washing away the last traces of the tyrannical billionaire he had pretended to be for 4 decades. He looked past me, then down at the ruined bearer bonds, turning into soggy pulp on the tarmac. The flawless diamonds he had hoarded were now completely lost in the dark, oily puddles surrounding the landing gear of my newly acquired jet. He opened his mouth to beg again, but a new sound pierced through the heavy roar of the storm and the whining jet engines. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing louder and more aggressive. Sirens. Winston froze, the blood completely drained from his already pale face. He slowly turned his head toward the entrance of the secluded airfield. Through the driving rain, a fleet of dark, heavy-duty SUVs tore through the main security gate. Their flashing red and blue emergency lights cut violently through the darkness, illuminating the wet asphalt in chaotic bursts of color. They did not slow down to coordinate with the airfield tower. They sped directly onto the restricted runway, forming a tight, aggressive semicircle around the base of the Gulfstream jet, effectively blocking any possible route of escape. The doors of the lead vehicle flew open. Half a dozen federal agents wearing dark rain jackets with FBI printed across the back in bold yellow letters stepped out into the storm. They moved with absolute tactical precision, their hands resting cautiously near their holsters. Winston let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He tried to scramble backward up the slick metal stairs, his wet dress shoes slipping uselessly against the grating. He looked up at me, his eyes silently pleading for sanctuary inside the aircraft. I simply took another sip of my champagne and took a half step back, giving the federal agents a completely unobstructed path to their target. Winston Montgomery, the lead agent, shouted over the deafening noise of the storm and the jet engines. "You are under arrest for severe federal tax evasion, corporate fraud, and attempting to flee federal jurisdiction. Keep your hands where we can see them and step down to the tarmac." Winston did not move. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer reality of his nightmare coming to life. 2 agents marched briskly up the metal boarding stairs. They grabbed Winston by the shoulders of his soaked, ruined suit jacket and hauled him roughly to his feet. He offered absolutely no resistance. His legs gave out entirely, forcing the agents to practically drag him down the steps and onto the flooded runway. They pushed him against the side of a federal SUV. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed with a profound sense of finality. The man who had terrorized his employees, abused his family, and thought he was entirely above the law was now being read his Miranda rights in the pouring rain. I stood at the top of the stairs, perfectly dry beneath the shelter of the cabin door, watching the empire builder being reduced to a federal prisoner. I felt a profound, magnificent sense of closure. The job was officially done. The Montgomery family had been entirely dismantled, stripped of their wealth, their pride, and their freedom. I turned around, preparing to hand my empty champagne flute to the flight attendant and instruct my pilots to power down the engines. But then, a terrifying sound ripped through the stormy night, completely distinct from the wailing police sirens and the roaring jet engines. It was the high-pitched, furious scream of a high-performance sports car engine being pushed to its absolute limit. The federal agents spun around, instinctively reaching for their weapons. I stopped in the doorway and looked out over the dark airfield. Tearing down the access road at a suicidal speed was a sleek silver sports car. It did not slow down as it approached the shattered security gate. It smashed right through the remaining wooden barrier, sending splinters of debris flying into the rain. The car fishtailed wildly on the wet asphalt, the tires shrieking as the driver fought to regain control. The vehicle violently corrected its course and sped directly toward the runway where the federal vehicles were parked. The headlights cut blindingly through the torrential downpour. I recognized the car instantly. It was Bradley. After being unceremoniously thrown out of his $20 million penthouse by my security team, Bradley had nowhere left to go. His corporate assets were frozen, his trust fund was locked away forever, his mistress had abandoned him in a corporate lobby, and his own father had left him to take the fall for a massive federal indictment. Pushed into a corner with absolutely nothing left to lose, heavily intoxicated, and consumed by sheer psychotic rage, Bradley had managed to track his father to the private airfield. The silver sports car skidded to a halt about 50 yards away from the jet. The driver's side door flew open. Bradley stumbled out into the storm. He looked absolutely deranged. His expensive suit was torn, his tie was gone, and his face was twisted into a grotesque, terrifying mask of pure hatred. He saw his father being shoved into the back of an FBI vehicle, but he did not care. He did not run to help Winston. He did not even look at the federal agents shouting commands at him. Bradley locked his bloodshot eyes directly onto me, standing victorious at the top of the boarding stairs. "You ruined my life!" Bradley screamed. His voice was raw, tearing through his throat with absolute murderous fury. "You took everything from me!" He did not surrender to the federal agents closing in on him. Instead, Bradley dove right back into the driver's seat of the sports car. He slammed the heavy door shut. The engine roared with a deafening, terrifying intensity as he slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The rear tires spun frantically on the wet tarmac, kicking up a massive spray of dirty water before finally catching traction. The car shot forward like a silver bullet. He bypassed the federal vehicles entirely, swerving dangerously close to an agent who had to dive out of the way. Bradley was not trying to escape. He was looking straight through the rain-streaked windshield, his face fixed in a grimace of absolute madness. He was aiming the heavy, speeding vehicle directly at the metal boarding stairs where I stood. He was going to ram the jet. He was going to kill us both. The silver sports car hydroplaned across the flooded tarmac, the engine screaming as Bradley pushed the accelerator to the floor. The vehicle cut through the heavy curtain of rain, a guided missile, fueled by nothing but blind, toxic rage. I stood at the top of the boarding stairs, the freezing storm whipping violently around me. I did not step back into the cabin. I did not flinch. I just watched the man I had once called my husband hurtle toward me with absolute murderous intent. He was aiming directly for the base of the metal stairs. He wanted to shatter the structure to bring me crashing down onto the concrete, to end my life simply because I had refused to let him control it anymore. But Bradley had spent his entire life underestimating the people around him, and he had vastly underestimated the elite security contractors my father employed. Before Bradley could cross the final 50 yards of the runway, the blinding glare of high-beam headlights cut viciously across his path from the right side of the tarmac. One of the massive black armored SUVs belonging to the Croft security detail surged forward from its perimeter position. The contractor behind the wheel did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He slammed his foot on the gas and drove the 3-ton tactical vehicle directly into the path of the speeding sports car. The impact was deafening. The armored SUV struck Bradley's silver car with the devastating, unstoppable force of a freight train. The horrific crunch of crumpling metal and shattering glass echoed across the dark airfield, momentarily drowning out the roar of the jet engines and the rolling thunder. The sheer weight and momentum of the armored SUV violently redirected the sports car. Bradley's vehicle spun completely out of control, the tires screeching wildly against the wet asphalt. It slammed brutally into a reinforced concrete storm barrier at the edge of the runway. The front end of the expensive sports car crumpled inward like a discarded soda can. The airbags deployed instantly in an explosion of white powder, filling the cabin with thick smoke. Then there was an eerie, hissing silence. The federal agents who had just placed Winston in handcuffs by the transport vehicles immediately drew their weapons and sprinted toward the smoking wreckage. My security contractors jumped out of their armored SUV entirely uninjured, moving with absolute military precision to secure the perimeter and block any secondary threats. From my vantage point at the top of the boarding stairs, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the carnage. The silver car was completely totaled. The driver's side door was crushed inward, and steam hissed violently from the shattered radiator as the freezing rain poured over the hot, twisted metal. 2 federal agents approached the wreckage with their weapons drawn, shouting sharp tactical commands through the pouring rain. They grabbed the crushed frame of the door and wrenched it open with a loud groan of protesting steel. Bradley was slumped against the deployed airbag. He was conscious, but just barely. His pristine, arrogant image was completely eradicated. His face was covered in blood from a deep, jagged gash on his forehead, and his left arm hung at a grotesque, unnatural angle. He was not shouting arrogant threats anymore. He was not the golden boy of the Montgomery Empire, demanding respect from the people he viewed as beneath him. He was sobbing. It was a high, pathetic whining sound that carried pathetically over the noise of the storm. The agents did not show a single ounce of sympathy for the billionaire heir. They grabbed him by his uninjured shoulder and hauled him roughly out of the wrecked vehicle. Bradley collapsed onto the wet tarmac, screaming in sheer agony as his broken arm shifted. He curled into a fetal position in the muddy water, weeping hysterically like a terrified child. An airport emergency medical team, already on standby due to the federal raid, rushed onto the runway with a stretcher and a heavy trauma kit. They knelt beside Bradley in the freezing rain, quickly assessing his injuries. They strapped a thick cervical collar around his neck and began cutting away the sleeve of his ruined suit jacket to stabilize his severely fractured arm. Winston, who was still pinned against the federal vehicle across the tarmac, watched the entire scene unfold with absolute horror. He had just seen his only son try to commit murder and fail spectacularly. The patriarch squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away from the pathetic display. He did not call out to Bradley. He did not offer any words of comfort. He just surrendered to his own absolute defeat. As the paramedics hoisted Bradley onto the stretcher and strapped him down tightly, the lead federal agent stepped right into Bradley's line of sight. The agent looked down at the broken, bleeding man with cold, professional disdain. "Bradley Montgomery," the agent declared, his voice cutting sharply through the rain and the approaching ambulance sirens. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Bradley sobbed louder, thrashing uselessly against the heavy medical straps holding him down. He twisted his neck, his bloodshot, terrified eyes searching the wet tarmac until they finally found me. I was still standing at the top of the stairs, leaning casually against the doorframe of my private jet. The storm raged all around us, but the shelter of the cabin kept me perfectly dry. I looked down at the broken, weeping man being loaded into the back of a flashing ambulance. He was already facing multiple federal fraud charges, and now he had just added attempted vehicular homicide to his rapidly growing list of indictments. He was going to spend the rest of his natural life inside a federal penitentiary. He stared up at me, his mouth opening as if he wanted to beg or scream or apologize for the 5 years of torture he had put me through. I did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not glare at him, and I did not gloat. I simply looked at him with the cold, absolute indifference you would reserve for a crushed insect on the sidewalk. I took one final deliberate sip of my champagne, turned my back on the flashing red and blue lights, and stepped inside the warm, luxurious cabin of my aircraft. 6 months had passed since the torrential rainstorm on the New Jersey tarmac. The violent crash of Bradley sliding his sports car into a concrete barrier felt like a distant memory, replaced today by the sterile, perfectly climate-controlled environment of the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute authority. My father, Jonathan Croft, sat quietly beside me. We were not there to testify. The meticulous forensic accounting trail I had handed over to the FBI did all the talking for us. We were simply there to witness the final curtain drop on a family that had built their entire identity on cruelty and deception. The federal judge, a no-nonsense man with a fierce reputation for handing down maximum penalties to white-collar criminals, did not waste any time. The sentencing phase was a rapid, methodical execution of justice. Terrence was the first to stand before the bench. The former chief financial officer, who used to strut through the Montgomery Logistics headquarters in bespoke Italian suits and imported leather shoes, was now wearing a baggy, faded orange jumpsuit. The arrogance that had defined his every waking moment was completely gone. His shoulders were slumped, and his hands trembled as they rested on the defense table. The prosecution had leaned heavily on him, but his cooperation could only do so much to mitigate the sheer scale of his embezzlement. The judge looked down at Terrence with absolute disgust, citing the millions he had stolen and laundered through Caribbean shell companies, while employees lost their jobs. The gavel slammed down. Terrence received a 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There would be no early parole for the financial architect of their ruin. I glanced briefly over my shoulder to the back of the courtroom. Penelope was sitting in the very last row, trying to hide her face. She looked absolutely unrecognizable. The FBI had seized every single property, every bank account, and every piece of jewelry she owned to pay back the stolen corporate funds. The IRS had hit her with massive penalties for tax evasion, linked to her illicit real estate holdings. To avoid going to prison alongside her husband, Penelope had been forced into a brutal plea deal that required her to pay back millions in restitution. The woman who once told me to take the service elevator to the alley now worked the graveyard shift at an all-night diner in Queens. Her designer manicures were replaced by grease burns and bleach stains. She looked exhausted and broken. She did not even look up as her husband was led away in handcuffs by the armed marshals. Next was Winston. The patriarch of the Montgomery Empire shuffled to the podium. He had aged 20 years in the span of 6 months. His silver hair was thin and unkempt, and the fierce, commanding posture he had used to terrorize his employees and family had completely collapsed. The judge did not hold back. He outlined Winston's decades of aggressive tax evasion, his corporate fraud, and his cowardly midnight attempt to flee federal jurisdiction with a briefcase full of stolen bearer bonds. Winston tried to speak, tried to offer a pathetic apology about making bad business decisions under extreme financial pressure, but the judge cut him off immediately. "A prestigious name does not grant you immunity from the law," the judge stated coldly, looking right through the former billionaire. Winston was sentenced to 20 years without the possibility of parole. He let out a quiet, broken sob as the guards grabbed his arms. He knew, and everyone in the courtroom knew, that he would take his final breath inside a concrete cell. Finally, it was Bradley's turn. He approached the bench with a heavy, painful limp. His left arm was still wrapped in a thick, restrictive brace from the collision on the runway. He looked terrified. Bradley was facing the most severe charges of the entire family. Not only was he fully implicated in the corporate fraud and the conspiracy to defraud the generation-skipping trust fund, but the federal prosecutors had aggressively pursued the attempted vehicular homicide charge. Bradley wept openly in the courtroom. He blamed his father. He blamed Terrence. He even tried to blame Monique, claiming he was a victim of emotional manipulation and extreme stress. The judge stared at him with complete contempt, describing his actions on the tarmac as the work of a deranged, entitled coward who resorted to attempted murder when he could no longer buy his way out of a problem. The gavel struck the sounding block one last time. Bradley was sentenced to 25 years. As the guards dragged him away, he turned his head and locked eyes with me. He opened his mouth, pleading silently for a mercy he had never once shown me. I just offered him a slow, chilling smile and turned my face away. The criminal proceedings were over, but my business with the Montgomery family required one final signature. I took an elevator up 3 floors to the civil division, where my elite legal team was waiting. The presiding family court judge reviewed the massive stack of paperwork detailing the complete liquidation of the Montgomery corporate and personal assets. She looked over the breach of fiduciary duty claims and the finalized divorce filings. I stood before the bench one last time, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. The judge picked up her pen. "By order of this court, the marriage is officially dissolved," she announced, her voice echoing in the quiet chamber. "Furthermore, due to the extensive financial damages and documented fraud, Hannah Croft is hereby granted 100% of the remaining liquidated Montgomery assets as full restitution." She signed the decree with a sharp, decisive stroke. The paper was stamped and filed into the public record. The Montgomery legacy was not just bankrupt or disgraced, it was officially erased from existence. I stepped out of the federal courthouse and into the crisp afternoon air. The heavy oak doors closed behind me, sealing away the ghosts of the past 5 years. I did not look back. My armored vehicle was waiting at the curb. The drive to the Croft Holdings Tower felt different today. For months I had been operating in a state of calculated war, dismantling an empire piece by piece. Today, the war was over. I was simply going home to claim my throne. The lobby of Croft Holdings was a masterpiece of black marble and brushed steel. As I walked through the towering glass doors, the atmosphere shifted. Hundreds of employees, executives, and security personnel stopped what they were doing. They did not whisper or point. They simply stood a little taller, offering quiet nods of absolute respect. They knew exactly what I had accomplished. I had not just inherited a billion-dollar corporation. I had proven I was ruthless enough to protect it. I bypassed the reception desk and stepped into the private executive elevator. The doors slid shut, and the high-speed lift carried me smoothly to the top floor. The penthouse suite of the tower was silent, flooded with natural light from the panoramic windows that overlooked the entire city. I walked down the plush, carpeted hallway and pushed open the heavy double doors of the master executive office. The room was breathtaking. It was a space designed for a ruler, featuring a massive obsidian desk walls lined with priceless art and a view that stretched for miles across the skyline. My father, Jonathan Croft, was standing by the window. He turned around as I entered. For the first time in my life, I did not see the terrifying, untouchable billionaire the rest of the world feared. I just saw a father, radiating immense, undeniable pride. "You did it," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did not just survive them, Hannah. You completely dismantled them. You showed them what it means to cross this family." I walked toward the center of the room. "We did it," I corrected gently. "You gave me the tools. You gave me the opportunity to prove myself." Jonathan shook his head, a warm smile breaking through his usual stern expression. "I gave you a fake identity and cut off your access to my wealth. You walked into a den of arrogant wolves completely unarmed. You mapped their weaknesses. You endured their cruelty, and you waited for the exact, perfect moment to strike. You earned this empire, Hannah. I am stepping down. The board has been notified. The chair is officially yours." He gestured toward the massive leather chair behind the obsidian desk. I walked around the table and placed my hand on the smooth leather. For 5 years, I had sat on cheap plastic chairs in a cramped townhome, balancing my laptop on my knees, while my former husband mocked my ambitions. I slowly lowered myself into the executive chair. It fit perfectly. The office doors opened with a soft click. Patricia, my lead legal counsel, walked into the room carrying a single, slender black folder. She approached the desk and set it down in front of me. "The final wire transfers have cleared," Patricia announced, her tone ringing with professional satisfaction. "The court order was executed without any delays. 100% of the remaining liquidated Montgomery assets have been successfully transferred into your personal holding accounts. Their corporate real estate, the sale of their luxury vehicles, the auction of the private jet, and the remaining cash from their seized accounts, it is all yours." I opened the folder and looked at the final number at the bottom of the ledger. It was an astronomical sum. The Montgomery family had hoarded wealth to terrorize people. They used money as a weapon to keep me compliant, to hide their own failures, and to crush anyone who dared to question their superiority. "What are your directives for the capital?" Patricia asked, pulling a silver pen from her jacket. "Should I route it into the primary Croft investment portfolios?" I stared at the number for a long moment. I thought about the thousands of women who were currently sitting in the exact same position I had been in. Women who were being belittled by arrogant husbands. Women who were told they were worthless, barren, or stupid. Women who stayed in toxic, abusive marriages simply because their abusers controlled the bank accounts and held all the legal power. "No," I said, looking up at Patricia. "I do not want a single cent of Montgomery money mixing with the Croft empire. We are going to do something much more poetic with their liquidated legacy." Patricia readied her pen. "What are your orders, CEO?" I leaned forward, clasping my hands together on the desk. "I want you to establish a new charitable foundation. We will call it the Vanguard Initiative. You will take every single dollar from the Montgomery liquidation and deposit it directly into this new foundation. I want to build a massive, unstoppable legal and financial strike team." Patricia raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "A strike team?" "Yes," I confirmed. "We are going to provide elite, ruthless legal representation and immediate financial independence grants to women who are trapped in abusive, financially controlling marriages. If a woman is being starved of resources by a wealthy, manipulative husband, this foundation will step in. We will pay for the best divorce attorneys in the country. We will provide emergency housing, secure private bank accounts, and living stipends, so these women can walk out the door without looking back." My father chuckled softly from his spot by the window. "Using Winston and Bradley's money to destroy men exactly like them. It is a masterpiece, Hannah." I closed the black folder and handed it back to Patricia. "Get the paperwork started today. I want the foundation operational by the end of the month. Let us make sure the Montgomery fortune finally does something useful for society." Patricia nodded, a fierce smile on her face. "It will be an honor." She turned and marched out of the office, ready to execute the final phase of my victory. My father walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. He squeezed it, once a silent transmission of absolute trust and respect. He then quietly exited the room, leaving me alone in my new sanctuary. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the towering glass windows. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant, fiery glow across the sprawling metropolis. The city looked beautiful, vibrant, and completely open to whatever I chose to do next. The heavy, suffocating weight of the past 5 years was entirely gone. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, looking down at the streets below. They slapped me because they thought I had no one to protect me. They didn't realize that, even without the Croft Empire behind me, I was a seed that could root in concrete. Money is just a tool to pay the bills. True power is ensuring no one ever gets to put a price tag on your dignity again. The greatest lesson from Hannah's journey is that true power does not come from the wealth you acquire, but from the unyielding boundaries you set. For years, the Montgomery family used their perceived status to diminish her, confusing her silence with weakness. However, she proved that financial dominance is merely a tool. Ultimate strength lies in reclaiming your dignity and refusing to let abusers dictate your worth. When you stop seeking validation from toxic people, you become truly untouchable. What is the most important boundary you have ever set to protect your peace? Share your story and comment below.